Hello. Before I get to the topic of the video tonight, I would first want to remind everyone that if you look in the description below the video, you'll see a link to sign up for the newsletter of the school. And if you sign up for that newsletter, then you'll get a monthly email that has a summary of some of the teaching over the past month, usually, the highlights. And by signing up, you'll get a free copy of the PDF edition of a new book, which is The Path and the Power, which is a interpretation and commentary on the Tao Te Ching. There'll also sometimes, most of the times, be some kind of new teaching or a specific teaching for the newsletter. So if you want to get that, sign up. It doesn't cost anything, and you can get to make sure that you don't miss anything from social media or what have you. One example of that kind of special material might be selections from some of the teachings of the Yifa Society that are usually only available to people who are members of the society and working through the curriculum of the Yifa Society, which is, for those of you who haven't heard of it from the other videos yet, a teaching school that teaches a curriculum of spiritual self-transformation founded on the principles of the I Ching and of Qigong practice, and that works to allow you to manifest the superior individual through a process, your higher self, through a process of disciplines and contemplation. So today's video is an excerpt actually of a fairly advanced teaching, you could say. It's a selection from a level 4 teaching that is from a book of advanced commentaries, which are kind of peripheral commentaries related to the philosophy of the Yifa Society. It's not really a direct instruction, but important details and concepts to understand. And what it's talking about is how freedom is the basis of all spiritual self-transformation. And also, you could say, of the transformation of a society, the spiritual evolution of a society, which is a very important concept in the higher levels of the Yifa Society work, that we're working not just to transform ourselves, but to help the transformation, the spiritual evolution, if you would, of human society. So freedom is the basis of all spiritual self-transformation. It's the most essential quality that needs to be discovered to be able to transform. Because only when you understand your freedom can you make your choice. The choice we're talking about here is that choice between what the concepts that the I Ching describes as the inferior person or the superior individual. At any given moment, we have a choice. At every moment that we're making a decision, that we're taking action in our lives, which is to say, at every moment, because if you've looked at the commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita, at every moment, we are doing an action. That action is a choice. And we have this constant choice between in how we act and how we react to situations and in what we choose to do, between manifesting the inferior person, that part of us that is made up of all of our personality, of all of our social influences, our personal influences from our life, our fears, our ego, all of the things that kind of work to keep us focused on ourselves and to keep us small and to keep us limited and trapped. Or what the I Ching calls the superior individual, which is the self that has stepped outside of that self-referential perspective and is instead looking at a perspective of union to reality. So freedom is an essential part of making this choice. because it's in the process of the choice itself that liberation and transformation starts to happen. You can't have another force or institution like the state or a church forcing you to make that choice, because this doesn't produce the desired results. Sometimes individuals, social or religious groups, movements, political parties, or other would-be governing elites of some kind get it in their head that they could just make people, force people to follow what they would imagine is their idea of the behavior of something akin to the superior individual. But really, it's just their attempt at imposition of their morality on others. And it's usually wrong, not necessarily from the point of view of conventional morality, but wrong in the sense of not a reflection of natural reality, right? But even if it was right, even if what they were doing was something that was genuinely in following with nature, with reality, with what is truth, trying to coerce someone into making the choice of being virtuous can't generate any virtue. It can't produce any inner transformation. All it can do is an imitation of a certain behavior, but it doesn't change something from the inside. The only time this choice can produce transformation is when people make that choice to embody the superior individual instead of the inferior person, and they make it individually, freely, and completely without coercion. Some people, including some very intelligent people, believe that this is only a characteristic, or this sort of concept of spiritual freedom is only a concept of one special religious or spiritual system, sometimes their own. They might claim that freedom as a prerequisite to spiritual transformation is something that, well, it exists in Buddhism or in some Eastern system. Or conversely, that sort of idea of having to choose, of that free will to choose, is something unique to Christianity. Or that some specific or major religious tradition, conversely, absolutely does not have that underlying spiritual system based on individual freedom. So some people will level that kind of accusation at a religion like Islam, or other people might level that accusation that it doesn't believe in spiritual freedom to Christianity. Now, this perspective, this erroneous perspective, is usually the product of someone failing to examine with sufficient depth the nature of the esoteric forms of religions other than their own, or the ones that they grew up around. Or sometimes, in the case of suggesting a specific spiritual tradition and not being based on freedom, on having only had experiences of or knowledge of the repressive and anti-esoteric, degenerated strains, you could say, of a given spiritual tradition, one that no longer actually functions as a vehicle for transformation. But the truth is that it's a part of the perennial philosophy, of that underlying formula of spiritual truth that can be found beneath the trappings of every religious movement. So every religious tradition has, in that pure formula, a requirement of there being a moment of choice. And to be able to have that moment of choice requires freedom. And to have that freedom requires an instance of awareness. So the choice then involves overcoming, deciding to let go of all of your attachment to your small self or your petty self, what Buddhists might call attachment, or Christians might call sin, or other religious traditions may view in other ways, but all of them have a fundamental similarity in that it amounts to this: you simultaneously choosing to believe that you're at the center of your own world. That's attachment, and that's also sin. And that from this center you are in control, which in turn forces you to limit your own potential and the amount of the world, the amount of reality that you can even see, much less take joy in, because you can only allow it to enter those parts of reality that are sufficiently small and petty enough for you to maintain your own illusions of your importance and your control. So the I Ching speaks of this moment as being that choice between the inferior person and the superior individual. Do you remain small and petty in order to hold on to a sense, to this illusion of control? Or are you willing to surrender that illusion of control to embody something bigger than yourself? The method of making this happen can vary from one tradition to another, as a method emphasizing contemplation, or a method emphasizing devotion, or a method emphasizing concentration or disciplines, or some balanced combination of the three, always coupled with the need to act on these internal methods in the external world, though the recommended way of acting might vary. So freedom is not something that anyone else can give to you. It's not something that anyone else can really take away either, because it's an internal state. People can take away your rights, though they don't grant them, because it is a right that comes from inherent human nature, the right to act on your freedom. And the more that a society does try to take away that right, beyond the limit of restricting actions that would, say, directly cause injury to other people, then the more hostile to spiritual truth that society usually becomes, and typically also to truth in general. A society that contains lies and is trying to promote lies as part of its fundamental cultural paradigm, it usually has to restrict freedom and to stop people from being able to understand and then expose those fundamental cultural lies. And almost every culture in history has had fundamental cultural lies. Charges of heresy and the persecution of heretics were usually the result of someone vocally exposing the social lies in the context of spirituality. Societies will engage in heresy hunting or censorship or persecution as a way to avoid the exposure of those lies, because they want to reinforce their cultural fantasies and protect them from having to be changed. Conversely, the more that a society defends freedom, the healthier a society will be, in the sense of being able to allow people to develop as autonomous individuals, and thus to discover their own superior individual. People tend to imagine that Confucianism, to give one example, is somehow a highly collectivist and anti-individual philosophy. But in fact, fundamentally, it's intensely focused on the individual. And while elements of the Chinese cultural paradigm seem, especially to a Western eye, to be less focused on the idea of individual freedom than the West might be, Confucius was actually working to try to oppose the parts of that paradigm of his culture which were against individual freedom and in favor of working towards a society that was more individually free. In his culture, he was doing this in opposition to some of the other dominant philosophies like Moism and legalism, which were fundamentally opposed to the individual. So you see this in Confucius's emphasis on meritocracy and on the need for individual and universal education, because these things make society more likely to allow for the individual discovery of personal freedom. And thus, the periods in Chinese civilization that were the peaks of that culture were those which put the greatest emphasis on the equal and free development of the individual. And the darkest periods of that civilization were those where those anti-individual ideas from legalism and Moism were revived or redefined in newer packages presented, for example, as communism, and the freedom of the individual to choose and to develop were repressed. In people as individuals, an opposition to freedom is usually an expression of their own fear that freedom will challenge the personal illusions and lies they've created around themselves to be able to cling to that fantasy of their own inferior person and of their own centrality. Whether this is the fear of other people expressing their sexuality in the way that they would want, or to dress differently from how a person in that culture is supposed to dress, or to do what they want with their own bodies, or whether it's that they fear other people saying or thinking ideas different than their own, or that they personally feel offended by these words that people are saying. All of these are a product of defending that fear to try to hold on to one's own bubble of reality. This is the reason that it's not enough for people stuck in that mode of the inferior person to deny themselves choices, but they also must try to deny that to others. They have to stop other people from thinking differently than they do. They have to stop others from living their lives differently from how they do. They have to define that other way of thinking or other way of doing as perversion or as offensive speech, or in the old-fashioned way as heresy. They must do this because the nature of someone else refusing to conform with their own worldview fundamentally offends the illusion of that house of lies that they've constructed as their own personal paradigm. It's this vision of you being in the middle of everything. It exposes as false the underlying fantasy that you might have, that you're in the middle of all things and that you're in control. And if you're trying to stop others from having their own choice, from having the opportunity of doing what they want in thought, act, and word, then you need to take a good hard look at why you want to stop them and why it offends you. All of this matters because while no society can take away our internal freedom, that freedom that we have to make a choice in any situation, whether we follow the inferior person or the superior individual, a freedom that someone like King Wen even had while he was in prison, that Mansur al-Hallaj even had as he was in front of his executioners, this freedom that even death can't take away from you, that only we can take away from ourselves because of fear. If we as a society encourage the opportunity for free choice in our expression, in our intellectual world, in our individual choices over ourselves, then we create a world where more people are more likely to reach that moment of individual autonomy, where they understand that their real freedom is the choice to liberate themselves and to strive to help others liberate themselves. So the freedom of the individual to choose must be encouraged and defended. If you like this video and you haven't done so already, then please subscribe to this channel. Take a look at the playlist of the Yi-Fa Society in particular, and the other playlists where you'll find a lot of interesting videos on a variety of subjects. And if you're interested in learning more about spiritual practices, then check out the Yi-Fa Society, and if you would like to try to work that practice in your own life, then send me a message about receiving an application for it. That's everything for today. Thank you very much.